I'm Sean Gregory, and I'm back with one of this year's Time 100 honorees, chef, restaurateur, and author, Gabriela Ca. Gabriela, thanks so much for joining us on Time 100 Talks.
Thank you so much, Sean. It's really lovely to be here.
Congratulations, first of all, on making this year's Time 100 list. From A Tale of Two Kitchens, the documentary about your Mexico City and San Francisco restaurants, to the book you published last year, your story and your work has received so much recognition as of late. What's your reaction to being named to the Time 100 list for 2020?
I never expected such a recognition. I think it's extraordinary. Time magazine is a huge thing. Who doesn't know about it? So I feel very honored.
A major theme of this year has been the movement towards equality. You believe that food can be a driver of social change and social good. How is that principle lived out in your restaurants?
Well, I truly believe that change only happens, a little bit at a time. Change only happens in concrete ways. So, just put it in other words. And I've always believed that if you can make life better for yourself and the people around you, then that's the beginning of whatever greater things you can do after that. So at the restaurants, the reality is that I only try to be sustainable across the border. I try to be sustainable, with ingredients, with hiring practices, with fair pay, and with thinking about everybody and considering everybody who's a part of the team as every human should be treated and considered. I never thought I was doing anything extraordinary when I opened Contramar. It was a different culture. It was, 2 decades ago. And I started really taking into account the human factor of restaurants, which is the most important part of restaurants. And I then opened this restaurant in San Francisco 5 years ago, which unfortunately is still closed due to COVID. But what I did there was to find a team that really could take pride in being a part of the team and could really benefit from a job that would offer them, full medical and dental benefits, sort of a really good above minimum wage full-time job. So for that, I hired people that had a conviction history and that were, that had served their time. And it was a really good match because they needed a job. I wanted people that would commit full time to make a team, like a tight team, because I believe in tight teams. I believe restaurants are, they're such transient places. People come in and out all the time. But if you have a team that welcomes the different guests that come in and out, you create much more of a sense of belonging and a sense of sort of community and sharing, and I believe that's a huge asset besides good food and good and good service and good drinks, of course, and hospitality in every sense of the word taken to the highest level. I do believe requires that human component. We all have had to think about these things much more. We've all been really forced into looking at things in different ways. And I find it very gratifying that, some of the things that I've been doing for so many years are now such relevant issues and on the table for many more people.
In the past, it's been your policy to, as I understand it, add a charge to diners' bills to help cover health insurance for your workers. What kind of impact has that policy had?
Some guests hate that idea, that notion of not having sort of the power to tip and to sort of control your, whomever is serving you by having the power over what they're going to be making. But I actually feel, and this takes us to a very different subject, or not very different subject, but to a sort of a subject that is on point with this. In Mexico and in other places, for example, in Europe, one is forced to pay for social insurance for workers and medical insurance for workers. And there's a social system that sort of requires that and makes that general for everybody, every citizen. And in the United States, that's independent. So people, if you have medical insurance, you're either in a company that's really wonderful because they offer you that, or because you pay it yourself. you don't have that sort of government imposed social tax, so to speak. And I do believe that it is very unfair in most restaurants in the United States that since tips are every waiter's earning, then they can do whatever they want with it and they do not have to share it with the rest of the team. So it becomes really challenging for the employer to then have to either compensate by paying such different wages to everybody or salaries, or by hiring people who are ready to work for very little money. So I believe that in terms of making a better, a more even team, a more egalitarian team, the sharing tips is a really, really smart thing to do. And it's challenging because you have to charge more. But I also believe that restaurants have to stop subsidizing a lifestyle of people who do have money and can pay 20% more or 25% more. Because it's like, if you want good ingredients and you want good food, it's not going to be cheap. We know that cheap food doesn't really do the same thing as good, healthy food. And I'm not talking about, high end or low end, but I'm talking about nutrition and the impact, like ecological impact and social impact of what we do in restaurants. And I really do believe that in the United States, especially in San Francisco, when I opened 5 years ago, it was really forward, but it was also a solution to a crisis that most restaurants were and still are going through, and much more so now that 80% of restaurants probably won't reopen. And it's not that solved it, because who knows if Gala will ever reopen, but the really important thing is that we need to start off at a more even ground with everybody, and that's the reason for the service charge.
And we're talking about the issue of restaurants impacting people outside of the diner's table, people all around. Another way you've tried to do that is locally sourced ingredients. Why is sourcing food locally so important to you?
Well, first of all, because you support your local economy. Then it's also, you have less of an ecological impact on what you do. I mean, restaurants are already super impactful in terms of, waste, in terms of pollution, in terms of use of energy. And of course, the footprint is relevant. And if you don't need to travel your goods these long distances, then everything makes much more sense. And there are always exceptions. I've never been a black or white person in that. I really never have been like extreme. I believe that there's a range between the two extremes. And for example, from Mexico, we always brought spirits or wines from Europe, or even olive oil. I mean, I'm not that radical. But I do believe that the more, and we have a history of exchange of goods that is the foundation of civilization. We have all these proofs of exchange of spices and utensils and materials of different types. So we need that exchange. And as humans, one always wants things that aren't what you have around you all the time. However, I do believe that the less impactful we can be, the better off we will be.
You're speaking to us from Mexico. Just want to talk a little bit about what you're doing in Mexico. Contramar, one of your restaurants, recently celebrated its 22nd anniversary in Mexico City. It's been an enormous success. You've advised the president of Mexico on food issues, describing your informal role as, I want to be sort of like a human rights watch, but for food. What does that mean, and what have you accomplished to date in your role?
Oof. Okay. So Contramar has become an institution. I never imagined that when I opened it. If I would have known how difficult it is to run restaurants well, I probably would have never done it. I had no training in it, no training whatsoever. I just loved food and I loved cooking, and I thought there was a need for a restaurant such as Contramar. My role with the president, the impact that it's had, well, I think it's been very challenging. I mean, the majority of the population of Mexico voted for this president because we really desperately wanted, needed, dreamt of a change. And it's been more difficult to see the change than when we imagined it, of course. I think of this period as a transition. So I think, what have I been able to do? Well, I've been able to be a part of a government, of a president that's a very responsible person in terms of the entirety of the country. Corruption in Mexico and in the world is a very serious issue. And it's not easy to sort of make do with corruption that has been going on for centuries, literally for centuries. They say that the Spaniards were able to establish such a strong culture in the, in the New Spain, or establish the New Spain, because the Aztecs had a very authoritarian empire that they sort of like plopped over. So they took over the institutions and the system of operating. And the Aztecs were apparently quite terrible to their dominated people around. It hasn't been a colony like in the way that other, the New Spain was part of the Spanish Empire. So it had sort of more stature, if you may, politically. But these practices have been very, 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 very much a part of what Mexico is, for good and worse. So it's been very challenging. And the government is not ideal. And I see it, as I said, I see it as a transition. And I see it, I think there are many things that we have been able to do. Unfortunately, I mean, one of the only advantages of COVID has been that in this pandemic, we really have realized how important nutrition is for our well-being and our health. And most of the people who are dying are people who have not been very well nourished and have child diabetes, obesity, cardiovascular diseases. And these are all things that one can really improve with food. So for example, now in Mexico, it's mandatory to state the amounts of sugars that prepared foods have. So that's been a really good advance. But of course, there are so many things to do. And in Mexico, I think there's a pride in re-owning the countryside, because most farmers have had to leave their places of origin and have migrated either to Mexico City or to cities in the United States. And that's been very tragic for the production of organic local foods. I really believe that one of the silver linings, the silver lining of this pandemic has been that farms have prospered in ways that, or small farms have prospered in ways that they hadn't for the past decades. So, there are small changes. And again, I really believe that you need a big idea, but you need concrete steps to making change. And I think that that's what we're doing.
As you've noticed, as you've pointed out, your restaurants have struggled during the pandemic. The restaurant industry as a whole has really had a tough time. How do you think the pandemic long-term will impact the restaurant industry? I
unfortunately think that, many restaurants will not be able to reopen. So that's going to be a loss, and that's going to be a really big loss for especially the people who put the money in for these restaurants to exist. And the people who had jobs in restaurants, in good restaurants, that won't be able to have that job anymore. But I do believe that it's going to be a selection of only the really significant and prosperous restaurants will be able to survive. And I think in that way, it's sort of it's a selection that is understandable, and it's a selection that will inevitably, shift everything in the industry. I also believe that it's, the real shift is in how we think about food and how we nourish ourselves, each other, the impact it has on the economy, the true impact of our industry, which hadn't really been addressed. It was an important topic, and it was an important topic for certain, in certain groups and certain parts of the industry. But in general, I think we've lived in an industrialized, obsessed society, right? Like, we wanted everything to be fast and good and available for everybody. And that's a fantasy that now we really have, seen fall down, or like completely collapse, or almost completely collapse. So I don't know. I don't know. I think from the beginning, we've been saying this in this industry, right? It's a good time to rethink things, to rethink how we do things, why we do things one way or the other, and how we can really have a more positive impact everywhere. So I always believe that the more thought that goes into whatever one is doing, the better results and the better, the better the outcome. And in restaurants, it was high time that we thought about all these issues more at large. And this is why, restaurateurs and chefs like Jose Andres have had such an impact in the world, because they, because we, I guess, are doing things that do matter and things that do make the lives of the people around us better. So why not think about it for more people? Why always assume that one lives being sort of blindsided toward of a huge part that makes how we live possible, but we don't want to look at it and talk about. So I think it's very important that all these things come out. And I think that that's going to be one of the good things about COVID.
And last thing, Gabriela, if there's one thing that you'd like to see change to make a more forward-looking restaurant industry along these lines, what is one thing that the industry as a whole can do after COVID to, kind of enact the vision that you're talking about?
I repeat the same thing that I've always said: to make restaurants sustainable across the border, in terms of who we hire, why we hire them, how we pay them, what we pay them, who we buy from, how they farm it, where they get it from. The less impact, the better. Just to be sustainable, not only to present a beautiful dish to a guest that wants to pay whatever money for it, but that we tell the story better, and that our story is a better story.
Gabriela, congratulations again for being named to the Time 100, and thank you so much for joining us today on Time 100 Talks.
Thank you so much. It was lovely talking to you, Sean.